one of the earliest of the group that we are remembering. He was a classical Marxist who resisted efforts to import what he considered to be alien concepts in Marxism in the name of making it more realistic. His celebrated work, In Theory, Classes, Nations and Literatures, contained a critique of Edward Said's Orientalism that sought to establish the primacy of the classical Marxist tradition. His scholarship encompassed several disciplines: literature, literary criticism, history, philosophy, politics and political economy. And he was also passionate about Urdu poetry and did a book on the ghazals of Ghalib, which he translated a set of ghazals into English and then gave those translations to poet friends in the US, who were English poets who interpreted those ghazals in their own idioms. Amazing book. He was a fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, at Jawaharlal Nehru University also, and at Jamia Millia. He wrote extensively in Frontline and was a contributor to both Social Scientist and the Marxist. He was associated with the publishing house Leftward from its very inception, and with the online news portal NewsClick, which sadly had to shut down after the raids last year. Aijaz at some point was a Pakistani citizen, and the tragedy of his life was he could not remain in India because of that under the new dispensation, even though India was the place where he was most at home. Suneet Chopra, probably the most dedicated Marxist of this entire group, for those of you who knew Suneet. He studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and then enrolled in JNU for postgraduate research. He was one of the founders, he was a member of the CPM, Communist Party Marxist, and was one of the founder members of the Democratic Youth Federation of India, DYFI, and subsequently an office bearer of All India Agricultural Workers Union. Suneet was passionate about art and became quite a well-known art critic, and also had amassed an amazing collection of art, especially of younger artists. All the auto drivers at the metro station here knew Suneet, because he would take the metro from Gurgaon and come here, and you still run into them when you get into an auto and they, say, oh, you're an associate of Suneet's. He was really a man of the people. Anil Bhatti was a student in Germany studying German literature and philosophy in the late 60s. Came back to India in 1971, joined the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was very active in the JNU Teachers Association, and later became chairperson of the Center for German Studies at the JNU and the dean of the School of Languages. Anil Bhatti was one of the people at the Kasoli Arts Center at the seminars which were being held there, and was one of the people who helped start the Journal of Arts and Ideas and was on its editorial board. The journal, which ran for many years and maintained an extraordinarily high standard, was an eye-opener to the intellectual possibilities that exist in the country. Kumar Shahani, filmmaker, studied at the Film and Television Institute of India, FTII, in Pune, where he was tutored by Ritik Ghatak, the great Bengali film director. Kumar was very closely associated with SAHMAT, as were all of preceding people I've spoken about. He and Mani Kaul became the kind of pair famous for launching a new language of cinema. Both were highly thinking filmmakers and broke boundaries of how film was made and how film was looked at and what filmmaking meant. After the FTII, he went to study in Paris and assisted the great director Robert Bresson in 1969 on his film Une Femme Douce. Coming back to India, he made a number of films: Maya Darpan, Tarang, Khayal Gatha, Kasba. Also documentaries on Kelucharan Mahapatra and a number of other documentaries. Char Adhyay on Tagore's stories. But the uniqueness of Kumar was he was not just a filmmaker, he was really an aesthetic philosopher, a very deep thinker, somebody that whenever you had a conversation with him, you really had to engage your mind. And a great sad loss. Professor Romila Thapar, you know, there's a cliche that needs no introduction, but she really doesn't. But Romila is Emerita Professor of History at JNU and a legendary figure there. She was General President of the Indian History Congress in 1983 and is a Fellow of the British Academy and holds an honorary D.Litt each from Calcutta, Oxford and Chicago, amongst others. I don't know the newest ones, Romila. And on her own site at JNU, her statement, "My research into early Indian history has been part of the shift from treating ancient history as Indology to establishing it as a social science. The two themes on which I have worked are the social and cultural history of early India, which involved asking new questions of textual data and integrating some archaeological sources as well, in attempting to understand the correlation of society, economy, and religion." Romila has been one of our great public intellectuals, in the best sense of that word, and some of her most recent publications, Our History, Their History, Whose History, which is 2024, The Future in the Past, Essays and Reflections, 2023, Voices of Dissent, an essay, 2023. But what very few people know is, besides her immense contribution in the making of modern India, she's also contributed physically to making modern India, which very few people know. When Le Corbusier was coming to India for the first time, it was her, I think, uncle, P.N. Thapar, Romila? Was P.N. Thapar your uncle? Yeah. Who had, one of the people who had organized to get Le Corbusier to come and work and design Chandigarh. And at the last minute, somebody discovered that there was nobody to go and pick him up at the airport in Delhi. And that task was handed to the very vivacious young lady, Romila Thapar, who went to the Delhi airport and picked up Le Corbusier. I hate to think if that first experience of India had not happened to him, what might have ended up in Chandigarh. Akeel Bilgrami, who is to deliver today's lecture, studied at the University of Bombay, Oxford University, and the University of Chicago. Professor Bilgrami has two relatively independent sets of intellectual interests. I think there are more than two, but in the philosophy of mind and language, and in political philosophy and moral psychology, especially as they surface in politics, political economy, history, and culture. He is professor at Columbia University. Akeel, here you are, and has been chairman of the philosophy department at Columbia, the director of the Hyman Center for Humanities, and also the director of the South Asian Institute at Columbia University. Number of publications, some of which I'll cite briefly. Capital, Culture and the Commons, which is 2022. Marx, Gandhi and Modernity, 2014. Who's Afraid of Academic Freedom, with Jonathan Cole, which is 2014. His book, Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, with Harvard University Press, publication in 2014. With these brief introductions, I hand over to Romila to chair this evening's session. Thank you.
Ram, need something.
I hope you can all hear me.
No.
Good evening, everybody. No response. Let me begin by expressing my great delight at having been invited to chair this lecture. My delight being largely because I know very little about the subject, but I know that after listening to Professor Akeel Bilgrami speak on it, I will know a little more about the subject. And that's really what I'm greatly looking forward to this evening. Professor Akeel Bilgrami, speaking on understanding Gandhi on caste, will be a lecture on a fascinating subject by a brilliant philosopher. It's a terrific combination. One can predict that it will have many provocative thoughts as well as a few familiar ones, as is always expected in all really worthwhile lectures. We should look forward to thoughts that illumine the subject. And the lecture this evening is, of course, very special, evaluating Gandhi's thoughts on caste when he was a nationalist politician. And incidentally, before he became famous with the Attenborough film. Akeel Bilgrami's understanding of Gandhi's thoughts on caste will focus on the 1930s, well before, and would move on into the later decades. There has been much quiet reflection on the part of many people in these very recent years on the kind of society we want, a reflection which is in part a reaction to society being taken this way and that and not knowing exactly which way it was going to end up. And this was so especially on occasions when people wished to speak about something that needed to be said, but they were kept back from saying it for fear of being unnecessarily silenced. Others spoke out in small or large gatherings and have held this evening in our conversations. We are remembering, as it has already been said, friends like Suneet Chopra, Vivan Sundaram, Anil Bhatti, Kumar Shahani, and of course the very maestro of all of us, Aijaz Ahmad. And in remembering them in association with this lecture, this becomes a kind of Shraddhanjali, a tribute to the departed. And they would have been such an asset had they been here this evening to discuss the subject with us. The thoughts that Akeel's lecture will doubtless raise on Gandhi and caste will, I am sure, be intellectually most stimulating, given the explorations that Akeel has been making in the subject, and which we are all looking forward to reading in his forthcoming book, which will be published soon. At the same time, we also have to remember that if there was one subject that went every which way in the early 20th century, but kept returning to base and making everyone think about it again and again, it was the subject of caste. What was it in the past? How did it change? Who among those speaking about it gave it a fresh meaning? And were there new ways of seeing its function in society? Where does this discussion take us today? Fortunately, we have Akeel Bilgrami to speak to us about it, understanding Gandhi on caste. Akeel.
Thank you, Romila. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
After a decade of its dark night of the soul, Indian politics found on the 4th of June that it had groped its way into a tentative shaft of light. Though the sour stick of fascism is still in the air, we are now at least able to breathe. For this entire dishonorable decade, the present speaker was at a comfortable distance in New York, without cause for fear, since all he did was fantasize that the brigands who were running his country would, by some marvelous chance, all break their necks, or disappear into the sky from where the man at their helm, since he was not biologically born, was presumably fallen. But we are assembled here to celebrate, in memoriam, 5 intellectuals and artists and activists who, like many others in this room, were at no comfortable distance at all, working on the menacing scene each day in their dissent and resistance. Even Aijaz, who was an unwilling and enforced exile abroad in the years before his death, wrote regular dispatches to Frontline, joining Vivan and Kumar and Suneet and Anil in their remarkable work here, each in their own imaginative way, contributing to the political ameliorations that now fill us with some hope. It's a tremendous honor for me to be by Professor Romila Thapar's side this evening to speak in their remembrance. My subject is Gandhi on the question of caste. The task I've set myself is modest, merely to understand what his views on that question were. Modest though the task is, it's also fraught, since those views have been the object of hostile invective for some years, and so even just seeking to understand them will appear to many as an apologetic, which I have no wish to produce, since I am not a Gandhi puppet. But I will say this: I don't believe that Gandhi's views on this subject have been understood with the necessary depth. It's fine to find someone to be wrong, so long as you get right what you think is wrong. And it's with that in mind that I'll now make some extended remarks which present the larger framework within which I think his ideas about caste must be placed. I don't believe that we can fully come to grips with the subject of Gandhi and caste unless we situate it in his very deep anxieties about modernity, in particular capitalist modernity and the political structures of liberalism, which were, in his mind, surely accurately, an essential surrounding context of capitalism in the Europe of his colonial masters. Though, as is well known, Gandhi was not a socialist, a revolutionary socialist, even a glance at his Swaraj reveals that he recoiled from capitalism every bit as much as Marx had done. His recoil, of course, was not based, as it was in Marx, on a deep and systematic diagnostic analysis of capital, but rather on a deep and systematic understanding of the effects of capital on the culture and the cognitive mentality of a society and its people. Let me begin with two preliminary state-setting points. First, it's well known that Gandhi repeatedly says that he believes in caste, but not caste as hierarchy, perversely putting the point by saying that caste as hierarchy is a distortion of the originary Varna idea. What then is he contrasting caste as hierarchy with? One way to put it is that he believes in caste as heterogeneity, not hierarchy. I believe this is the right way to describe the great importance he placed on the need to retain the professional diversity of a society that is given to its people by the traditions of caste, conceived non-hierarchical. The concept of heterogeneity is apt because, for him, diversity of work and profession is one amongst the many other aspects of a general cultural diversity that he believed India's long-standing pluralism had always respected. But all this needs more patient exposition, precisely the exposition that is skirted when commentators on Gandhi wheel out like a mantra the meaningless phrase organic communities to characterize his view of Indian social life, a lazy slogan that avoids the hard work of providing the frameworking analysis that's needed, an analysis that works out how a diversity of professions and the wider cultural identities in which it traditionally nests stand in contrast with the straightening effects of capitalist modernity. It creates a form of life which undermines the heterogeneity of a culture and then consolidates that by adopting a form of governance defined upon a homogenizing notion of citizenship. We mustn't forget that at the time when he was writing, the idea of multicultural citizenship had never been articulated as a political theory. That idea only surfaced with any self-conscious explicitness in the last 2 decades of the 20th century to address the problems that had slowly emerged due to post-Second World War migration from former colonies into European nations. So all that Gandhi could appeal to was an unself-conscious pluralism that he claimed was everywhere present in Indian history. His initial skepticism about some prominent ways of opposing caste hierarchy, such as most prominently Ambedkar's, was prompted by an anxiety that they relied on the liberal democratic apparatus of governance and citizenship that were essentially tied to a capitalist modernity and abstracted away from the plural cultural elements he cherished. Now, it may be protested that Ambedkar's successful, powerful formulations of minority rights for Dalits reflect his own sort of commitment to pluralism, since minority rights, understood very generally, are often seen as reflecting a polity's commitment to pluralism. But this would be to misunderstand Ambedkar. Nothing in a specific understanding of minority rights for Dalits can be invoked to cast him as a sort of proto-multiculturalist in the way that I've cast Gandhi. He formulated minority rights with a view to seeking protection and justice for Dalits, not with a view to perpetuating their cultural identity. Such rights were intended to empower Dalits until such time as that empowerment could be deployed towards the eventual goal of the annihilation of caste and caste identities. Thus, unlike the minority rights in Western Europe, Canada, or Australia, which are formulated in the name of multiculturalism, Ambedkar's understanding of such rights was purely instrumental, relevant only until such time as Dalits achieved that eventual goal. Indeed, his sympathetic remarks on the aspiration of Indian Muslims to being a nation, rather than merely seeking minority rights, suggest that his entire conception of minority rights has nothing to do with any doctrine having to do with questions of culture and diversity, or with questions of claims to nationhood, questions that might have place for an intrinsic rather than a merely instrumental notion of identity. But now, equally, there's a misunderstanding about Gandhi that might arise and must be prevented. I have, as I said, cast him as a proto-multiculturalist, but there's a conspicuous difference between his views and the more explicit recent multiculturalisms in Europe, Canada, Australia. These have all embraced an evolving globalized form of capitalism. Their opposition is only to a state of liberal universalist secularism adopted by the European modern that refuses to recognize cultural difference. By contrast, Gandhi's insistent recall of what he sees as India's history of an unself-conscious pluralism was an essential part of his overall opposition to the threat of capitalist modernity that he felt was looming in India's future. It is this opposition that has to be presented as the framework that illuminates his views on caste and the cultural pluralism within which he thought his idealized non-hierarchical conception of caste had its significance. The second preliminary point of state setting that needs to be made is this. As anyone who's read Gandhi's evolving remarks on the subject knows, in the last decade or more of his life, he gradually shed his commitment to caste, even in these idealized terms that I've briefly expounded. As early as 1935, indeed he began saying this as early as 1927, he famously wrote a piece in Harijan with the title and message, "Caste Has to Go," thereby converging in many of his views with Ambedkar, though even then with hopes for a different framework of thought than Ambedkar's unblushing adoption of the modern rubric of parliamentary legislation and liberal democracy. Once Gandhi realized that rubric had gradually come to be central in the formulations of a national movement that was gearing itself to acquire statehood, a rubric forced on it by the Crown's constitutional form of concessions towards Indian self-governance in the 2.5 decades before independence. Gandhi then altered his idealized stance on the subject of caste to adjust to that emerging rubric, even as he held out in his more visionary pronouncements for an entirely different and novel ideal of state and governance. All this therefore requires us to integrate Gandhi's idealized philosophical stances with this evolving activism in the struggle for Indian freedom, an integration that's bound to be tense and ridden with ambivalence, for the glaringly obvious reason that activism, unlike philosophical reflection, speaks to more contingent demands. So the tasks at hand are complex and subtle, hardly surprising when dealing with a thinker as complex and subtle as Gandhi, and a political arena as complex and subtle as the national movement he led. Let me then begin on these tasks of providing the framework of Gandhi's attitudes towards caste by citing a remark he makes in a dispatch to Young India on 29 December 1920. The beauty of the caste system, he says, is that it does not base itself upon distinctions of wealth possessions. Money, as history has proved, is the greatest disruptive force in the world. So we must ask, what does he think life is before this disruption? And what is the significance of this disruption for his conception of caste as heterogeneity? To answer this question, we have to link these remarks about the disruptive effects of money to his related and repeated dismissal of the subject of economics and its laws as it developed in the West, and the notion of the economy that it studies. As he says, I'm quoting, I venture to think that the scriptures of the world are far safer and sounder treatises on laws of economics than many of the modern textbooks. And in case this was thought to be dogmatically anti-materialist, he explicitly disavows that, claiming instead that materialism, in the obviously true sense, had nothing to do with what economics studies by constructing laws. To quote him again, every human being has a right to live, and therefore to the wherewithal to feed himself and to clothe and house himself. But for this very simple performance, we need no assistance from economists or their laws. Like money, the notion of an economy and a subject that studies it distorts the relations to the world that Indians have for centuries inhabited. For Gandhi, to deny that there was any such thing as an economy in that sense amounted to the claim that all there is in India is society and culture, not economy. Usually when Gandhi spoke of an economy, the attitude his remarks reflected was that if society and culture simply adopted policies that were morally right, they would ere ipso amount to what was economically sound. Economy had no independent status that set it apart from society and culture and morality. This attitude is a fundamental plank of Gandhi's opposition to modernity, first formulated in Hind Swaraj, with its repudiation of the cognitive outlook shaped by capitalism. In 1909, when he wrote that work, he thought India was at the crossroads that Europe was in the early modern period. His shrill and harsh tone in that work reflected his desperate fear that India would seek to go down what he viewed to be the lamentable path of political economy and political governance that Europe had taken in the passage from its early to its late modernity. We must interpret all of the stances that I've cited above, about money, economics, the very idea of an economy, as a reflection of his refusal for India of this path of European modernity. But in doing so, we must find the right register for appreciating an essential quality of his refusal. One of the things that makes Gandhi so fascinating, especially for a philosopher, so here I'm declaring my own angle of interest in him, is not the obvious point that what we now see as outdated commitments to the social features of an unrecoverable past were only questionably outdated in India in 1909, but rather that those commitments were very anxiously made by him, and as a result, sometimes expressed by him in shrill and harsh tones. It is the source of this anxiety that is important to grasp. The anxiety arose because he vividly, perhaps too vividly, understood just how attractive the possibilities of a world that overcame those features of the past might seem to those poised to reap those possibilities, without any regard or even any grasp of what it entailed for those not so poised. This complicated anxiety, I believe, is a remarkably honourable sentiment for a social thinker to possess, and honourable in a quite intellectual sense. Because when I say he vividly understood just how attractive the possibilities that modernity offered were, I'm saying that he actually found it understandable that they should seem that way, even as he constructed it for a social thinker, writing at the crossroads where he stood and wrote, not to see the point of those attractions. It is only with such a full empathetic understanding of what one opposed, he thought, that one gave oneself the intellectual right to construct a social philosophy criticizing the claims of modernity. This attitude, I believe, preempts any dismissal of his ideas as mere nostalgia from tradition. So what then is it to think that economy was to be equated with society, not to be seen as something standing apart from it? Gandhi's ideas about work are crucial to answering this question. When, as in India and in Europe too for centuries prior to modernity, an economy is not something other than or independent of society, work is not something that is undertaken for ends, that is, for making a living, rather than merely being a way of living. It only comes to be a means to further ends when money is erected into an object of a goal, something to be earned by one's work for what it can gain for us. It is this which then introduces the idea of an economy as an autonomous sphere, abstracted from life or living, and not determined exhaustively, as it had been for centuries, by the fabric of social life itself. In Indian society, according to Gandhi, the routine structures of existence were all there was that motivated human actions and human work. There were no distinct economic motives. Not only did the millions of peasants that comprised Indian society simply do what custom demanded, or indeed what their masters demanded, even the masters, for all their possessions and privilege, only did what tradition and society demanded of them, whether religious, administrative, political, military, or courtly. Neither for peasant nor for overlord was there any angular orientation that was properly called an economic orientation. Society and its demands on them were all that defined them. Though Gandhi had anxieties about the development of towns and what they would bring in the future, at the crossroads he claimed India was in, he thought that what occurred in towns was merely business. And the conduct of business, such as it was in 1909, was also completely inseparable from non-economic social and traditional concerns. It was not prompted by the idea of a generalized conception of gain. It is partly to shun this generalized conception and to stress instead this ongoing and long-standing nature of Indian society that he undertook to comment on one of the chief moral and social lessons to be learned from the Gita, that work must be undertaken as service and social and religious duty handed down to one by custom rather than as something for ulterior ends of personal acquisition. Gandhi was not denying that human nature may always have been given to avarice, What he was denying in these remarks is that this aspect of human nature was never generalized in India into an ideology or an economic outlook. It is only when money acquires wide scope in society, he claims, that a new and distorting element is introduced, transforming the nature of labour. No longer does one person work for another for subsistence and sustenance. Rather, monetization makes work into a measurable quantity, a commodity to be made available by one's own free will, selling it in something called a market, transforming the very idea of a market from the traditional idea of a marketplace to the abstract thing that generates the notion of an economy and an apparently sophisticated subject called economics that studies it by constructing laws. Apart from labour, even the idea of property is transformed. Some members of Indian society certainly were possessed of tangible riches, mansions, palaces, jewels, glittering dress, bullion, forts, armaments. But once these came to be expressed in monetized terms, and a person's worth is measured with a number assigned to it, this new form can be deployed with indefinite flexibility as investment for returns. With these hitherto unknown motives of working for gain or deploying one's possessions for profit, the notion of an economy emerges and all of life is transformed. But no one's life would be more transformed, Gandhi feared, than that of the Indian peasant, who would be utterly dispossessed by this transition and made into a socially untethered labourer, moving from pillar to post to sell his labour in constant fear of destitution. His chief focus when it came to the Indian people was always on its millions of peasants. This creation of the economy as a self-standing formation, independent of social relations, and the distorting abstractions that it visited upon the concepts of labour and property and the living marketplace, was precisely something to be resisted by stressing the idealized conception of caste that he, in his early writing, refused to give up. So when he said that caste before its modern corruptions into a hierarchical system was just a Hindu ideal of a sort of dispersed version of guild differentiation, this should not be understood as a mere social conservatism, because it cannot, I claim, be understood independently of his rejection of the transformations that came with the notion of making a living in a market society when economy is now a self-standing thing, independent of society and an abstraction from social relations. It's interesting to note that his views here are identical with how Adam Smith describes some pre-modern and pre-capitalist societies, where, to quote Smith, each person was supposed to follow the trade of his father and would even sometimes be supposed to have committed some sacrilege if he did not. Gandhi himself invokes Jataka stories to make the point and speaks of a social differentiation based on apprenticeship within families that acculturate one into the form of labour or craft or trade. Members of different castes, in his understanding, did their own particular differentiated work without hierarchy, as he put it, as part of their swadharma, without contempt for one another, and with a full sense of the dignity of their labour. That work was an end in itself, in accord with the social norms constitutive of society, and the notion of an economy was not separable from any of this. To put it in a more contemporary form of words, to retain caste was to resist this market ideal that undermined traditional social relations by setting up the freely saleable labour of atomized individuals. Such a framework for understanding his views on caste is often missed because of a failure to grasp what should be a quite obvious methodological point. We should be drawing a significant, even if obvious, inference from the fact that Gandhi never made any serious effort to present any detailed historical evidence, nor even any historical reconstruction for what he pronounced to be caste as mere heterogeneity, nor of the form and manner in which, as he claimed, hierarchical strata are supposed to have later corrupted that purer form. There's nothing in his work, for instance, akin to a study of Harappan civilization and its successors and the emergence of the Brahmana caste conceptions as is found in Kusami, or as in Romila Thapar's work, as an unfolding of a complex structure of social formations that operated within a context that she labels a lineage system, bound by a range of norms and practices and beliefs that are only partially discursive. Even Gandhi's claims about India's unsubconscious pluralist past was never something for which he presented any historical evidence. In fact, Nehru's discovery of India is a far more conscientious effort to do so, despite the fact that it is not viewed as a serious piece of historical scholarship. But it would be a comical form of misunderstanding to think, not that it has deterred many from thinking it, that because Gandhi offered no such evidence for his idealized conception of caste, that he was some sort of brash amateur historian making a false empirical hypothesis. In the commentary on the Gita, Gandhi said, he read the work not as history, but rather as myth and religion and poetry. But his disregard for history in the context of caste has a somewhat different theoretical motivation. The obvious yet significant inference to be made from his indifference to historical evidence is that Gandhi, as a social philosopher writing on caste, is invoking a conjectural past in a theoretical deployment of mythos with the same theoretical motion as a much more modernist mythos is invoked by any number of political philosophers who appeal to a conjectural past when they, for example, posit a social contract. No social contract was ever drawn up in history. It's not the point to present it as a historical occurrence. The idea, rather, is to set up a normative ideal by presenting it as occurring in a conjectural past with a view to exploring and critically assessing what did occur in history. The political philosophers in question explored and assessed notions of state and governance via the normative model of a social contract. So also, it was Gandhi's purpose in setting up a normatively idealized conception of caste in conjectural history to explore the facts of caste hierarchy as we know them and to assess the claims to progress in capitalist and liberal modernity as a path to overcoming them. It is with a view to presenting a negative assessment of these latter claims that Gandhi posits the conjectural past of a non-hierarchical conception of caste. What does this employ for his own accompanying assertion that over the centuries terrible discriminations have emerged between castes that corrupted it into becoming a hierarchical system? That is to say, what moral and practical response does this corruption into hierarchy invite once the framework I presented and the cautionary methodological point I just made are in place? From the point of view that I've been expounding so far, where there's no economy but only society, Gandhi could obviously only give one answer to this question. The problem of an emergent hierarchy was to be addressed by society, internally and morally resisting its own corruptions, rather than introducing a newfangled and extraneous notion of an economy in which each individual transcended the social embedding in caste and made him or herself competitively available to something we now call the labour market. That would be to make labour a commodity, and his well-known remark in Hind Swaraj that caste ensured that each person followed his occupation without entering into a life-corroding competition was precisely intended to repudiate that prospect. For then, no longer would one man work for another in return for an assurance of sustenance and subsistence, and belonging. If one now as an individual freely sold one's labour to a buyer and what one was competitively paid for it was not enough to sustain one, well, no one was responsible for that in this new freedom to be found in such a system. Certainly not the buyer. He had no responsibility over and above paying the price that he could get away with paying in what came to be called the market. What happens next is no care of his. Gandhi's economic idea of a trust, something that could not possibly be expected to be implemented in a market system so conceived, was precisely to ensure that that responsibility was not shirked in social relations. But such social relations were exactly what were undermined by the idea of a market, self-standing idea of an economy independent of social relations. So for him to generate such a notion of an individual freely selling his labour in the emerging ideal of a market was the wrong way of addressing the hierarchical distortions that had entered caste. Hindu society, read large by him as Indian society, qua society, not economy, must seek internal moral resistance to these emerging hierarchical distortions. It's very important to point out here that Gandhi's ideas of this internal form of social resistance against society's stratifying corruptions was not the notion of religious social reform that had emerged in the last half-century before he was writing, which were drawing somewhat schizophrenically upon the ideals of European modernity, whose claims he was resisting. Rather, he was explicitly drawing upon much more folk and popular religious and spiritual traditions. Bhakti, including the early Varkaris, his own Gujarati Vaishnavism, as well as various Sant poets of Gujarat, and an assortment of regional sects and movements which D. Nagaraj discusses in his excellent article on Gandhi, such as Satnami and Mahima, to name just two, all of which sought reform entirely outside the modernist liberal categories with which India's colonizers had influenced the newly emerging, intellectually minded social and religious reformer. Moreover, Gandhi also made clear that such internal social and moral change to overcome emerging hierarchies of caste is possible only in unalienated societies where individuals are able to think from a larger point of view than their own, just the point of view that's undermined by the relations that define a market conception of economy. If India were to address these emerging hierarchies that had contaminated the idealized conception of caste as diversified professions by turning to capitalist modernity, one would have to rely not on internal moral resistance, but rather on what Marx called primitive accumulation, the process that dispossesses the peasantry from its embedding in existing social relations, which were no doubt exploitative, and sends them, as Gandhi put it, from pillar to post to sell their labour to avoid destitution, migrating to towns defined by market relations, entering there into new form of exploitative class relations, and in Marx's vision, forming new solidarities to resist such exploitation and thereby overcoming the hierarchies that had emerged in the caste relations of their erstwhile peasant existence. I still have in my possession a scribbled note by my father in his journal, which reads, "The machine will do far more than the Mahatma did to undermine caste by bringing different castes together to work on it." It is these claims of modernity that Gandhi instinctively denied, and I turn now to examine what those instincts were. In Part 8 of Marx's Capital, Volume 1, primitive accumulation is seen as the coercive, frequently brutal extermination of communities of a pre-capitalist form as a result of the deracination of petty producers from the sources or the means of their particular form of producing, peasants from their land primarily, and who then morph into a proletariat, either in the form of metropolitan industrial labourers or a reserve army of the unemployed. These accounts, though they observe the coercive and brutal nature of this destruction of pre-capitalist communities, are nevertheless also presented as the transformation into a new class formation in which the old primordial, hierarchical, oppressive features of social life, whether caste, tribe, clan, or religion, are undermined, even if they're replaced by the newly minted oppressive features tied to the specifically exploitative and alienation-inducing conditions that metropolitan capital imposes on industrial labour. This is the large theoretical claim standing behind the fascist entry in my father's journal. Gandhi's inclusion of Marx in the Western frameworks of thought that he rejected as irrelevant for large agrarian societies like India can be sympathetically elaborated, I think, by first asking a counterfactual question about the effect that primitive accumulation had on European populations. That is, by asking a counterfactual question about Marx's claim that the dispossession of the peasantry from their land to create Europe's great manufacturing towns was a first step in undermining the primordial ties and hierarchies of pre-capitalist community. Imagine the following scenario that is counter to fact. There is no settler colonialism that diffuses capital by moving vast numbers of the European peasant population dispossessed by primitive accumulation to various parts of the world, such as across the entire Atlantic, or to the Antipodes, Australia and New Zealand, or to the southern corners of Africa. Suppose that doesn't happen. In this counterfactual scenario, huge numbers of peasants, who in fact migrated to these places, instead live and remain sedentary in Europe. What reason is there to think that this massive population of peasants would have been absorbed into a new community of industrial labour? There's no serious likelihood that they would be accommodated inside the domain of capitalist production. They would remain as a vast pre-capitalist community outside of capital's domain. The crucial question now arises: would they then have overcome the oppressive, hierarchical and divisive features owing to caste and other such ties? The tribal divisions, the deeply riven religious schisms that were typical of European society of that time? Just consider the fact that whole wars were fought for years on end in Europe over obscure religious issues such as transubstantiation. So really, I'm claiming that Gandhi insisted on his commitment to the internal social transformation of caste because of a canny understanding that in colonial and post-colonial capitalism, the colonized lands were the factual version of something that was merely the counterfactual scenario in Europe as I just presented it above. To put it differently, primitive accumulation, as it's presented in the canonical Marxist accounts, depends, I'm claiming, not on the truth of a theoretical analysis, but on the observation of entirely contingent empirical features in European history. The fact of massive departure of peasant populations to other parts of the world as a result of settler colonialism. There could be no such analysis of primitive accumulation as Marx offers if these contingent empirical features were not also present. As a result, there's no reason to think that this particular section in Volume 1 of Capital amounts to a bit of theory at all. A theory implies the generalizability of its main claims, or a claim to some telos, or some structural explanatory power that accounts for diverse phenomena. But if I'm right, the account has no such properties. It is a local observation about European history over a specific span of time. If you wanted a vivid example of this fashionable phrase, the provincialization of Europe, Marx's account of primitive accumulation, as I'm reading it, seems to be just made for it. What I'm suggesting is that Gandhi understood well that in the colonized lands, given quite different empirical features, no prospect for large-scale migration of displaced populations as occurred in Europe due to laws that restrict transcontinental migration. These lands simply cannot absorb the displaced millions as industrial labor. In fact, they're not even likely to be transformed into a reserve army. He understood with clarity that his people, the vast agrarian populations of India, are just simply gratuitous in the kind of brave new economic formations which primitive accumulation produced in Europe. Economic formations we tend to characterize with such terms as growth and development, and view as overcoming the primordial hierarchies and schisms of peasant society. Thus, for him, internal transformation to address caste hierarchies is made necessary because a primitive accumulation would not in any case lead to the emergence of a relatively liberated, even if differently subjugated industrial labor in India. Instead, even industrial laborers would continue to be caught up in the primordial and hierarchical features of pre-capitalist community, something we see everywhere in urban India today and in the politics of identity that surfaces not just in rural, but metropolitan India as well. Just to give one example, sociologists have observed that communal riots occur predominantly in cities, a symptom of the pre-capitalist community's metropolitan survival. Here then is where we are in the argument to understand Gandhi's attitudes towards caste. We've expounded his denial that Indian society in 1909 was characterizable by an independent formation called the economy, and his insistence that in India, unlike Europe, it is society, culture and morality, and nothing else that defines our relations to each other and the world, as well as shapes our motivations that yield our public behavior. We then pointed out that though he had argued that those relations were once defined by an idealized set of caste relations in terms of professional heterogeneity, these were no longer so characterizable, but had admitted of deep and invidious hierarchies. This combination of points, we said, is what yields as inference that internal resistance within Hindu society is the only right way to address the hierarchies that now define caste relations. We then consider whether allowing for the very notion of an economy as an independent sector of human life that filled Gandhi with anxiety would offer an alternative and more progressive way of addressing these social hierarchies of caste, as is on offer in the standard accounts of primitive accumulation owing to Marx. With the aid of a counterfactual, we concluded that Gandhi's instincts were that these accounts of the effects of capitalist development were not theoretical accounts, but local observations of an extended movement in one continent of the globe, inapplicable to large agrarian economies of the colonies of the South. They could not, according to him, address the hierarchies of caste that defined Indian society. So, the time has come then to take up a question that I've mentioned in my opening remarks. How do these claims of Gandhi, the philosopher, relate to Gandhi, the central activist figure in Indian history in the first half of the 20th century, leading a nationalist movement against British colonial rule? One way of approaching this question is to notice that Gandhi's philosophical stances about the relations between economy and society were remarkably similar to the stances taken by the Narodniks in Russia, who stressed an idealized version of their own pre-capitalist formations and sought to construct a populist nationalism based on a similar recoil from the capitalist incubation that European nations had embraced, seeking more direct routes to radical transformation than Marx had envisaged for Europe. At least the Marx of capital. Marx of the last decade of his life is a different story. Now, as we all know, Lenin had conducted a famous polemic against the Narodnik position. But what is not often noted is that Lenin had also made a distinction that is relevant to understanding Gandhi. In a work entitled The Economic Content of Narodism and the Criticism of it in Mr. Struve's book, Lenin writes this, and I'm going to quote a sort of gorgeous passage at some length. Here's the quote. I make a distinction between the old and the contemporary neuroticism on the grounds that the former was to some extent a well-knit doctrine, evolved in a period when capitalism was still very feebly developed in Russia, when the petty bourgeois character of the Russian nation had not yet been revealed, when the practical side of the doctrine was purely utopian, and when the Narodniks gave liberal society a wide berth and instead went and worked among the people. It is different now. Russia's capitalist path of development is no longer denied by anybody, and the breakup of the countryside is an undoubted fact. Of the Narodniks' well-knit doctrine with its childish faith in the village community, nothing but rags and tatters remain. In place of aloofness from liberal society, we observe an intimacy with it. And it is this change that compels us to distinguish between the ideology of the peasantry of the old Narodniks and the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie of the later Narodniks, who had become like Janus, with one face looking to the future and the other to the past with its obsolete social forms. What should be clear is that if there's an affinity between Gandhi and the Narodniks, he in his own mind would have viewed himself as falling under Lenin's characterization of the old rather than the later Narodniks. So the question before us is whether over the decades after Hind Swaraj, and more particularly from the 1930s on, Gandhi was altering his attitudes towards caste because the contingent opportunities that the Crown was bestowing upon the national movement by constitutional concessions towards self-governance were forcing him to withdraw his, to use Lenin's phrase, aloofness from liberalism, and finding himself having to keep in step with and respond to Ambedkar's, to use Lenin's rhetoric again, intimacy with liberalism. This transformation of the national movement was not restricted to matters of governance. What Lenin called Narodnik ideology of the peasantry, a label that in some crucial respects captures the Gandhian critique of capitalist modernity, could no longer fully dominate the national movement. Ambedkar was, from Lenin's point of view, par excellence the face of what he called the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, with its wholehearted embrace of the liberal democratic apparatus. This was the ideology whose effects on the national movement forced Gandhi into chronic ambivalences and steered him to his exquisite reversals on caste, because he was now rendered by these contingent developments into resembling the later Narodniks, who Lenin describes as Janus face, looking one face to the future, the other to obsolete social forms. Nothing displayed the ambivalences more than the events surrounding the signing of the Pune Pact. These ambivalences are more complex than the simpler dichotomies of traditional and modern peasant ideology and petty bourgeoisie would suggest, because of the contingent demands of an anti-imperialist movement. Staying with Lenin's classical image, the Gandhi mask of Janus that looked to the future had to now address the issues of the representation of Dalits in electoral politics. This may give one the impression that it's the other face of Janus, looking to obsolete social forms, which exhaustively determined his stance that there should be no separate electorates. After all, didn't Gandhi say that separate electorates would undermine the unity of the Hindu people? But to take these words to be backward-looking in any simple sense is to misunderstand his motives, because that unity for him was at bottom the unity of the Indian peasantry in the freedom struggle, a unity that he regarded as indispensable for the struggle. Unlike the celebrated Russian meal, which was taken by both Marx for this last decade and the Narodniks to already reflect the promise of peasant solidarity in the fatherland, the peasantry in India, as Gandhi pointed out again and again, has to constantly struggle so as not to be divided by caste or religion. And it was this face of Gandhi, that of the peasant ideologue of Lenin's description, this Narodnik, who wanted the entire peasant class to be mobilized in the national struggle, which was motivating him just as much as any concern about a unified Hinduism. Gandhi's Khilafat movement had been explicitly launched with a view to overcoming the potential religious divisions of the peasantry by involving the Muslim Kisans, as well as the Muslim urban poor. His resistance to separatist politics of caste that would emerge if he conceded to Ramsay MacDonald and to Ambedkar was just as much to preserve an undivided Hindu peasantry in the nationalist mobilization. If he also made concessions to upper caste Hindus, which he did till the caste must go phase of his thinking, that was also motivated by this goal of unity. I have tried to present Gandhi's political motives on this vexed issue, but when it comes to the moral psychology involved in the issues around the Pune Pact, I think Gandhi failed to apply some of his own insights in the stances he took. It is often claimed that, on Gandhi's behalf, that the Pune Pact, which followed upon his fast protesting the communal award, secured greater empowerment for the Dalits than the award would have done, since it fetched them more representation. I am much less confident of this, and my reasons paradoxically owe as much to Gandhi's thinking on the subject as to Ambedkar's. As I said, the issues here turn on the moral psychology of politics. Both Ambedkar and MacDonald had made their moral psychological point very clear. They proceeded from the assumption that in the electoral field, social groups vote with nothing but their group interest in mind. Thus, if there was a general electorate rather than a separate Dalit electorate voting for Dalit candidates in reserved seats, they would vote for those Dalit candidates who would best serve their rather than Dalit interests. Gandhi's opposition to this proceeded with a quite different and much more idealistic assumption. A group whose members are not socially alienated from each other will not vote with narrow factional self-interestedness, but vote from the point of view of what is best for the worst off amongst them. This commitment to an unalienated society is, of course, what both Gandhi and Marx, coming from their different political positions, had erected as an ideal. Gandhi's idealism on this matter is dismissed by his critics, beginning with Ambedkar in that period, with some recent commentators even dismissing this moral psychology as the hypocrisy of a Brahminical hegemonist. A remarkable accusation to bring against a man who worked for decades at great cost to himself and eventually to his life to oppose untouchability. But even those who do make this accusation dismiss Gandhi's stance as being too idealistic. In-group, out-group thinking, they say, cannot be avoided when it comes to parliamentary politics, and the face of the Jainist Gandhi that was forced to look to the future, where such politics had been imposed by colonial rule, was simply not facing up to the cynicism. My own view is that the failure of Gandhi's moral psychology of caste politics is not that he fails to face up to the truth in the assumption that social groups always vote with their own interests in mind. There's no wholesale crime in holding out for a more idealistic conception of what human subjects are capable of. Rather, it's Gandhi's failure to acknowledge that social groups, even when they're not cynical in this way, too often lack the imagination to really grasp the detail of the nature of the suffering of the more deprived groups, and thus fail to grasp what exactly it is that will but best serve their interests. As I said, paradoxically, Gandhi himself, in various things he wrote, acknowledged the importance of guarding against the inadequacies of human imagination. In 1921, he says, "I would be rather torn to pieces than disown my brothers of the suppressed classes. I don't want to be reborn, but if I have to be reborn, I should be an untouchable, so that I may share their sorrows, sufferings, and affronts, in order that I may endeavor to free them from their miserable conditions." In 1924, he says, "We must first come to live in living touch with them by working with them, we must be pariahs too and see how we feel to clean closets of the upper castes and have the remains of their tables thrown at us. Only then can we represent the masses. But these remarks are sensitive, both these remarks are sensitive to how much personal strife and striving must be undergone or undertaken before one can rise to the imagination that's needed. But Gandhi quite simply failed to acknowledge and guard against such failures of imagination when he insisted that we can rely on caste Hindus in a general electorate to vote for those Dalit candidates who will serve Dalits' interests best. And it cannot be claimed, as it sometimes is, that this sort of concern is mitigated by the Pact's provision that there be a first tier in the voting system that would allow Dalits to select the initial panel of 4 Dalit candidates who then in the second tier be voted on by the general electorate. The fact is that if as many as 4 candidates were up for election, there was wide scope for Dalits who had little desire to promote Dalit interests to get onto the panel of candidates. In the very period of the Pune Pact, prominent Dalit figures claiming to represent Dalit interests, such as M.C. Raja and G.A. Gawai, had shown their willingness to be co-opted by the Hindu Mahasabha. Had a Dalit of this kind found a place in the panel of 4 candidates in the first tier, a general electorate might well have voted him in on the second tier, out of a failure of imagination, even if not out of cynical self-interest. Gandhi's failure to see this was, in fact, a failure, as I said, to apply his own moral psychological insights, and it is a conspicuous example of the sort of ambivalences he was forced into when his philosophical stances were confronted by the contingent demands of his political activism. I'm sorry, I've taxed your patience a lot. I'm just concluding in this last couple of minutes. I've been arguing in this lecture that Gandhi's entire thinking on the subject of caste must be situated in the larger framework of his opposition to capitalist modernity and to its destructive effects on the peasantry of large agrarian societies of colonized countries in India. Let me conclude then by putting aside the question of caste and speak just a word, more generally, to the lasting issues raised by this framework. The Leninist image of Janus, which I've invoked to present the ambivalences of Gandhi, looking both to the future of an India landed with a bourgeois democratic framework for politics, while also looking back to a philosophical vision of politics and political economy that would be obsolete within it, has continued to haunt Indian politics. Even when Gandhi was alive, as early as in the National Planning Committee in 1938, the backward-looking face of the Janus Gandhi, which was represented there by J.C. Kumar was sneeringly sidelined by those who dominated the committee, careening forward with visionary ideals derived from Soviet models of industrial development, summarily dismissing as obsolete forms all aspirations for development, including eventually industrial development, which could be built up gradually from the bottom, from a peasant base, with decentralized governance. In the rest of that fateful century, the only explicit representation of the peasant point of view in mainstream parliamentary politics at the national level came from Charan Singh, a leader whose aspirations for the peasantry were wholly conceived within a framework of agrarian capital structures that Gandhi had struggled to protect the peasantry from. It is this complete failure in our nation's politics to formulate a politics of regard for the peasantry outside the framework of bourgeois politics and its increasingly wholehearted embrace of late capitalist modernity that leaves us dangling to this day with completely unresolved questions about the peasantry's relations to fragmented, impermanently employed, barely unionized urban working population, to say nothing of the continuing unresolved questions of caste. Thank you very much.
I think we should move on to conclude the evening rather than getting distracted with questions, because it will be uncontrollable. At least I will not be able to control such a large audience, and the questions will be from anywhere to anywhere. And I say this because my own reaction to Akeel's lecture was a fascination with what he was saying, a wish that one could sit down with a small group and him and say, now look, I don't follow this, these are questions I want to ask, will you sit down and answer them at length for me? This we cannot do this evening. I've taken the easy way out. I'm simply going to talk about some of the notions from caste that came to mind as questions whilst I was thinking of what he was saying. Not necessarily related to Gandhi, but related, I think, to the very important questions that the debate between him and Ambedkar and his own writing, Ambedkar's writing, the national movement, what happened afterwards, questions that we haven't answered to this day. And let me sadly reiterate them. So if you will forgive me, listening to the lecture, I had the feeling that we had been shown the many nooks and crannies of the subject of caste, which we always tend to brush aside and say, no, that's not terribly important. But it's these little things that are, in fact, extremely important. What has surfaced is possible ways of exploring caste, which I think is extremely important, because there's not a single way, there are multiple ways. And it's about time that these multiple ways were in conversation and dialogue with each other and all. As they were once when the national movement was going strong. And somehow that seems to have quietened down in the years since. I wouldn't dare to summarize or even list the themes of this evening's lecture. But maybe I'll just put a few thoughts before you, emanating from the talk, which I thought was very, very provocative in the best intellectual sense, and then leave it to you to carry on and think further on the subject. As has been rightly said, caste today has to be examined in the context of modernity. And I think Akeel's lecture made that very, very clear. And it was beginning to be done, even a century ago, in small ways. Facing the change to modernity is not new. Caste has always to be seen, which unfortunately it is not, but caste should always be seen in the chronological context of the time that one is talking about. Because one of the social institutions of this culture of India that changed enormously in time was caste. It didn't remain absolutely static, as is sometimes believed. The forms of caste have been ways of organizing Indian society since it has not been static, nor have the forms. This was a pet thesis of colonial thinking, that Indian society was completely static and didn't change. The question that needs asking repeatedly is, how has it changed and what has caused these changes? And I think that would tie in with some of the points that Akeel was making about Gandhi's views. And what was fascinating was the earlier views of the 1930s and how he changed them later on. what causes that change? So few people talk about that, and it's so fundamentally important. Early references to caste and its presence are often described as a ready-made formation that suddenly appeared in Indian society, sourced from a deity. Looked at logically, however, caste was formulated in bits and pieces and slowly coalesced, adjusting to alterations where these were needed. The one hymn in the Rig Veda that is always quoted speaks of the four Varnas, and it is regarded by some scholars, by most self-respecting scholars today, it is regarded as having been added on much later when the whole caste structure had been actually worked out as a socially organized plan. And it was added onto this ancient text because this has always been done. Whenever you want legitimacy from the past, you add on the story to the ancient text and you say, there, it's in that ancient text, so it's legitimate. And this is a technique that is very commonly used, and many of us think this is an example of that. Caste is described in the Dharma-shastras as a developed social system with four distinctive groups, each with its own rules of procedure. And by the time the Dharma-shastras are written in the 4th century, these rules of procedure are fairly carefully worked out and laid down. And the more functional names of castes that immediately come to mind are interestingly not of Varna but of Jati. Jati has a functional names to a much greater extent. What is interesting again is how this whole debate on caste seems to bypass Jati and focus on the four Varnas. And this is, sociologically speaking, this is a debatable question as to what constitutes caste. And the Jatis, of course, talk about geographical regions as titles, geographical regions, clans, ancestry, occupations, religious sects, suggesting a huge variety of origins for particular castes. And this is something that's important. Rules are made with the intention that they must be strictly observed. But we also know that discrepancies can often slip through. We have one of my favorite ones is in the Shanti Parvan of the Mahabharata, for example. Bhishma is relating a story to Yudhishthir about the much revered, much respected sage Vishwamitra. There was once a severe famine in the land, and Vishwamitra was desperately hungry. Looking for food, he wandered all over the jungles and finally arrived at the hut of a Chandala and saw the part of a dead dog hanging there. So he attempted to reach out and eat it. He was stopped by the Chandala. Now remember the caste background of these people, Vishwamitra and the Chandala. He was stopped by the Chandala, who advised him against it. He didn't just stop him, he advised him. And he advised him, and he said that if you eat that dog, dead dog, in the home of a Chandala, that will destroy your punya, which you, Vishwamitra, have been accumulating so assiduously. The Chandala obviously knew the rules. That's the interesting point about this story, that he's the one who's advising the Brahmin not to do what he should do because he will be breaking the rules. Nevertheless, Vishwamitra ate the dog meat, then increased his tapasya by manyfold, and thereby made up for his loss. More than a few sources carry references to the breaking of rules or a degree of flexibility in their observance. And the origins of caste groups, when examined dispassionately, suggest something that Akeel spoke about, heterogeneity. The origins are heterogeneous. And we have to always keep that in mind. It's terribly important to understanding it. But in listing the castes in a hierarchy, the hierarchy introduces an order. And that's where the whole order comes in with the hierarchy. Caste was not God-given, nor was it invented at a particular moment in time. It evolved. This is the important thing that we historians have been grappling with, explaining how it evolved from period to period. In this process, it drew from multiple factors which introduced a diversity of rules. And rules, as we all know, when they need to be reshuffled, they are reshuffled. So rules are not static. Rules also change and have to be looked at carefully. The rules themselves come from diverse sources, and I'm really underlining the heterogeneity in a big way. Marriage rules, especially endogamy, differed and were crucial to caste formation, also crucial to the low status and functioning of women. Ancestral identities are terribly important. Lineages, clans, and so on. Occupations were meticulously segregated, two links to caste. And occasionally, a caste might also evolve out of a religious sect. We have this fascinating example of the medieval sect, the Lingayats, who evolve out of a Shaiva sect. And the interesting thing is that the rituals that they adopt are not always the rituals of the Shaiva sect, although they go on saying that they've evolved out of the Shaiva sect. For example, the Lingayats always bury their dead. And this is something that all good Shaivas don't do, need not do. Now, that means that not everybody observed these identities and these rituals of identities. That, again, becomes an interesting point. The denial of these identities led to counterclaims that questioned caste identities in those days. For example, the earliest of these were around the 5th century BC, when the Shramanas, this general term that is used for the Buddhists, the Jains, the Ajivikas, some people also include the Charvak, the Shramanas, who constituted a substantial section of society, rejected Vedic deities and texts, and they were called Nastika, non-believers. And the term Nastika continues right through the history of India, of Indian religion, right up to the 15th century, when the Turushkas, the Turks coming from Central Asia, are also called Nastika because they did not believe in the Vedic deities. Non-belief is a curious kind of thing, but is important. Then you have another term that was used for those who are opposed to the caste system for varieties of ways, mlecha, something we're very familiar with. It's used as a term of abuse, but it was not always a term of abuse. Mlecha simply means you do not speak an Aryan language and you do not observe caste. You are an outsider. So that is another thing. Marriage rules, of course, could differ. Occupations were listed as polluting and pure. And I think that these lists and the reasons why they're given this kind of description is something that we need to explore a little more. So, in this interplay of heterogeneity and hierarchy, which I think is very important, and I'm glad in a sense that Akeel also spoke of it from a different point of view, but anyway, It's very important to the organization of caste. It requires a particular belief about society. If you don't believe it, you're not part of it, you're a Gnostic. It requires people to control the hierarchy. Remember, the moment you put something in a hierarchy, someone has to come along and say, I am going to determine how the controls go. And that is exactly what happened when this heterogeneity was put into a hierarchy. People emerged who said, I will determine how the controls go. And that is partly why you get the Dharma Shastra and the 4 divisions. And the question to ask, it's a tempting question, it's a question to ask that was every hierarchy requires an axis. It's built around something. The question to ask is, was the notion of purity and pollution this axis in the hierarchy, as it seems to have been? Where did it come from? We're not very clear about that, and it's again something that could be looked up. Now, hierarchy, once it comes into existence, also encourages a split from what's acceptable to what's not acceptable. And this gives power to those who are defining purity and pollution and defining the reasons for the hierarchy. And the split, in this case, by the time you get to this kind of period of the late first millennium AD, there's much talk about a split of society into the Savarna and the Avarna. The Savarna are the castes that observe the Varna rules, that work according to the Dharma Shastras. The Avarnas are those that don't have those rules at all. They have no uniformity either. They don't have 4 niche groups. No, they're all over the place. They are described then as the Antyaja and the Asprishya, the ones on the edge and the ones you cannot touch. Were the Avarnas in a larger number than the Savarnas? This is the question which I think is important, because it gives a certain strength to one or the other. And of course they are seen as uniform. And the question that should also have been asked 1 century ago, when all these issues came up in the 1920s and 30s, was whether the existence of one category required the other category in opposition. In other words, is the hierarchy straight running, smooth, going from top to bottom? Or is there a break where that group is against this group, as it is in this case when you talk about Savarna and Avarna? The first group, the Savarnas, could suppress the Avarnas through controlling their labor. And I think that whole discussion that you brought in about peasantry is very, very crucial to this understanding of it. But it's presented in this hierarchy as a mythology. Purity and pollution comes back again. No one talks about it as labor. They talk about it as pollution. These are polluting groups. Why are they polluting groups? We don't know, but they're polluting groups. Which is why I think that there needs to be a much greater examination of what this notion really is about. And again, there are discrepancies in the use of this term, which I find quite fascinating. A Hindu trader from Multan, which is on West Punjab, donates a well in a settlement in the Palam area around here, near Delhi. He donates a well, digs a well, donates it, puts up an inscription, saying, I come from Multan, my family consists of this, and this, and I'm donating this well, and I'm donating it by the grace of our superb Sultan, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. And there's a huge verse of praise for Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and it ends up with saying, and he is a mlech. The first time I read this inscription, I said, oh my God, what does this mean? How can he be called a mlech? Then you realize that he's a nature because he's not observing Varna and he's not speaking an Aryan language. It's a perfectly respectable term to use for someone in that condition. His vocation is not polluted. That's an important issue that comes in. And then there were various other groups. There were those who denied the deities, of course, but also the rules of caste, determining caste. I mean, if there's one society that has been full of people that have thrown aside the social rules and said, no, we will go and live on our own in isolation, it's Indian society. The sants, the sadhus, the shamanas, the peers, you name them by the 100, every area has them. So all these people come to the fore and say, no caste for us. They deny caste, they deny all the rules that go with the caste, and the breaking of the rules is important to their identity. Now, I think that this is not important only in terms of numbers, but it's important because it's an attitude of people that are living in the midst of society and then moving out and going and forming their own institutions, like the monasteries and the dargahs and so on, which are different from societies. So the sants and the sadhus and the shamans and all have a kind of role to play in denying caste, which is important. And renouncers deliberately give up their caste identities, project themselves as outside caste society. This would have been problematic. What do you do with people like that? I mean, how do you accommodate them? Do you put them somewhere? Or what kind of status do you give them? They're not scavengers. They're performing the highest vocation in society. They're the learned people. They're the ones who are discoursing on religion. Yet they're denying caste and saying, we're outside all this. We don't believe in caste. What I'm trying to suggest is that even prior to modern times, there was a debate on caste categories. Maybe sometimes I feel that we should try and link up modern studies with earlier studies, because I think we tend to dismiss the early ones very easily. The counterpoint to Avarna and Savarna was not new, nor were discourses on the eligibility to caste status, although it may not have been discussed to the point of questioning caste. Oh, some cases it was, but in some cases it wasn't. In the context of Gandhi, we may consider the meaning of a term that he invented for the propagation of some of his ideas, namely satyagraha. It seems to borrow from the idea of the renouncer, the way in which he describes what a good satyagrahi is and what is his work and function. It needs exploration, both in terms of its precedence and its invention and its use. And the renouncers, the sants and the sadhus, cease to have claims of identity with family, caste, occupation, location, religion. And presumably, if a renouncer had to renounce caste status, he could no longer call himself Savarna. But at the same time, he couldn't call himself an Avarna. It's not the same thing. So what happens? What does he call himself? How do people react to that? A question that arose with the anti-colonial national movement was, what is to be done with caste? Many questions arose, but this was a very fundamental question. Akeel has explained the problem as it arose for Gandhi and for his times. And it still remains a question that we face. A society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity will have to be a society without caste. Now, whether we annihilate caste or we quietly fade it out or what we do, it has to be a society which does not observe caste. Otherwise, you cannot talk about liberty, equality, fraternity. And I think this was also one of the problems that Ambedkar might have had, because he was very keen on this. Doing away with caste, or even reducing its power, is not going to happen in a hurry. It will need dismantling all that supports caste, both the Savarna and the Avarna. That is, all the little niggling fittings that go into society which uphold the Varna system will have to be dismantled, as much as changing the rights, obligations, duties of the Avarna, or the untouchable. So I think that maybe one should begin to see it as the interplay of these two segments together, rather than simply the one group that has to be improved. Its dismissal also requires replacing many Savarna facets. Given the context of modernity, institutions that define the past and the structure of society have to give way to more challenging configurations. And this is something we must understand, that it's not just being anti-caste, it's seeing caste in a historical context in which these changes are absolutely essential. We couldn't do better in all of these discussions and dialogues than to clarify our ideas through more conversations with Akeel. So come again. And for the moment, at any rate, I hope there will be more occasions. Thank you very much.